Good morning. Before we start our story this morning, we are going to have a little guessing game. I'm going to think of an animal and you have to try and guess what animal I'm thinking of. I'm going to give you 3 seconds, all right? What did you think of? I was thinking of a mouse. Is that what you thought of? Let's try it again. This time, I was thinking of a camel. One last time. Did you guess a skunk? Because that's what I was thinking of. You know, it's hard to understand what other people are thinking, isn't it? But you know, God says in the Bible that his thoughts are even much bigger than our thoughts, and his ways are much different than our ways. And it's hard for us to understand sometimes what God is thinking and what is God doing. But in today's story, which is called Jacob's Troubles Multiply, we are going to see that even though Jacob doesn't understand God and what's happening, God knows what he's doing. He's always in control, and he can take something that is bad and make something good out of it. Now, Jacob and his family were just doing what everybody else did in those days. And we're going to see that when you do that, that makes a mess of things. Now we know that Laban had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel. Leah was the oldest one, and he had tricked Jacob into marrying her. He didn't love Leah. But a week later, Laban relented and he gave Jacob Rachel, the younger daughter whom Jacob loved. Now, here we have 2 sisters, and they're married to the same man. And this is not going to go well. There's going to be lots of jealousy and arguing. How can there not be? Now, you know, in those days, people lived in tents. And so before Jacob was married, he had his own tent. And when he married Leah, he gave her a tent of her own. And then when Rachel came along a week later, he gave Rachel a tent of her own as well. Now, when Leah had gotten married, Laban gave Leah a wedding present, and that wedding present was a servant girl called Zilpah. I mean, how would you like to have that as a wedding present? And then when Rachel got married, he gave her the same thing. He gave her a maidservant as well, and her name was Bilhah. So now within 1 week, Jacob has gone from living on his own to caring and providing for 4 women. 2 of them are his wives. Now we know that Leah and Rachel did not get along. Leah was unloved and unwanted, but not by God. He loved Leah. He remembered her. And in our last story, we saw that Leah has already had 4 sons. Rachel has none. Now in those days, it was very important to have children. I mean, if you had children, it was looked upon as God's favor. And if you didn't have children, well, that was a disgrace. Now Rachel is very angry, and she's jealous, and she's frustrated. She's resentful. Why should her sister Leah have sons and she doesn't have any? And one day when Jacob came in from the fields, Rachel met him, and she was so angry, and she said, I have to have children or I'm going to die. Well, Jacob, he just turned on Rachel and he said, what? Am I God? It's God that's withheld children from you. Do you remember the story of Isaac and Rebekah? When Rebekah couldn't have children, how Isaac prayed for her. But you know, we don't read anywhere in the Bible that Jacob prayed for Rachel. He was just upset with Rachel. Now Rachel is so impatient and frustrated. She said to Jacob, take my servant Bilhah, take her like a wife, and then I could have children through Bilhah. Well, Jacob did that. And you know, Bilhah had a son, and his name was Dan. And Rachel named him. She named him Dan. And she said, his name means God has heard me. And then Bilhah had another son, and Rachel called him Naphtali. And that means because of my struggle with my sister. Well, Leah had noticed, that she hadn't had any more children after Judah. She had stopped having children, and she saw what Rachel was doing, and she got jealous of Rachel. And so she said to Jacob, "Here, you take my servant Zilpah, and you take her like a wife and have children through her, and I'll have more children." Well, Jacob did. And you know, the first son that Zilpah had was Gad. And Leah was the one who called him Gad, and she said it means good fortune. Then she had another son, and his name, she called him Asher. Asher means how happy am I? Well, this family has kind of become a mess, hasn't it? I mean, everybody is doing what they want. Bitterness and jealousy and selfishness are the way that they are making choices. But you know, God is still in control. He is still going to bless Jacob and his family. Even though they are making sinful choices, God is able to work through that, because sin does not stop God from doing what he wants to do. Whatever God says is going to happen, it's going to happen. Now, one day during the wheat harvest, Reuben, who was Leah's oldest son, found some mandrakes in the field. Now, mandrakes they're a fruit that's like bright orange and yellow. They're kind of like a plum. But you know, in those days, there was a superstition about mandrakes. A superstition means something that people believe, but they believe it out of ignorance. In other words, they believe it, but it's just nonsense. And what they believed, what the superstition was that mandrakes could help you have children. So Rachel saw that Reuben had all these mandrakes, and she went to Leah and she said, give me some of your son's mandrakes." Leah said no, but Rachel begged her, "I want those mandrakes." And you know, Leah was so angry with Rachel, she just turned on Rachel and she said, "What? Is it not enough that you've stolen my husband from me, and now you want to steal my son's mandrakes?" I wonder if they argued like that all the time. But then Rachel said, "All right, listen, tonight Jacob can sleep in your tent if you just let me have those mandrakes." So Leah agreed. Now, you know, those mandrakes didn't help Rachel at all. And to make matters worse, as far as Rachel was concerned, Leah ended up having 2 more sons. So now Leah has 6 sons. After Judah, she had Issachar and Zebulun. She even had a daughter after that too, Dinah. Rachel still has no children. I mean, I think she thinks that God has forgotten about her, but he hasn't. He loves Rachel. He's not forgotten about her. Do you remember how Sarah had to wait 25 years for Isaac? And then Rebecca had to wait 20 years to have the twins, Jacob and Esau. And now after 20 years, Rachel has a son. God has not forgotten about her. Rachel gave birth to a very special boy, and she called him Joseph. Do you know, in the book of Genesis that we're studying, there are 50 chapters in that book, and 12 of them are all about Joseph. God gave Rachel the privilege of being the mother of Joseph. He grew up to be a man devoted to God, and God used him in remarkable ways. That's Rachel's son, Joseph. Now, soon after Joseph was born, Jacob decided that he wanted to go back to Beersheba. He wanted to go back to his own country. He wanted to see the inheritance that God had provided, said he was going to give him, and he wanted the blessings of God. But Laban did not want Jacob to go. He knew that God had blessed Jacob. His flocks had grown. I mean, Laban had become rich because of Jacob. But you know, there was a problem for Jacob, because Jacob didn't have any flocks to call his own even after all these years. So he said to Laban, "Listen, I'll still watch after your flocks, but how about we take all of the spotted sheep out of your flocks and all of the speckled goats that are in your flocks, and then the speckled and the spotted can become my flocks." Well, Laban thought about it and he said, "Yeah, sure, that'll be fine." But you know what? That very same day, Laban took all the spotted sheep, and he took all the speckled goats out of his flocks, and he gave them to his sons, and he sent his sons on a journey, 3 days' journey away from Jacob. He thought he'd solved that problem. But there was somebody who was watching over Jacob, somebody who saw everything, and that was God. And God caused Jacob to be able to build huge flocks, spotted and speckled. And Laban's sons saw this, and they thought, how is he doing this? How is it that Jacob's flocks are stronger than ours, and he has so many of them? They didn't understand what was happening. They didn't know God was helping Jacob. So they started to spread a rumor that, Jacob was stealing Laban's flocks. And Jacob also noticed that Laban's attitude had changed towards him. He wasn't so favorable to Jacob anymore. And one night God appeared to Jacob and he said, get up, go back to your own country, and I'll watch over you. So Jacob waited until it was sheep shearing time. Now, sheep shearing is when they take all of the wool off the lambs, now all of the wool off the sheep, because it becomes so heavy. They have to do it every year, and they make a big festival out of it. And so Laban had gone away to find his flocks. And it takes a while to do this, sometimes up to a week. There are so many sheep. So while the sheep shearing was going on, Jacob packed up everything. He packed up his tents, all of his possessions. He put his wives on camels, took the maidservants, the children, the flocks, everything, and they left. Now, just before they left, Rachel went in and stole Laban's household gods. Laban was not a worshiper of God, and he had his own little household gods that he worshipped. They're weird looking, aren't they? But Rachel took them, and the Bible doesn't really tell us why she took them, but she did. Now, when Laban got back, he was enraged when he saw that absolutely everyone and everything was gone. And so he got his relatives together, and they pursued Jacob. Now, just before they caught up to him, they had been pursuing him for 7 days. God appeared to Laban in a dream, and God gave him a warning. He said, when you see Jacob, you do not say anything to him. You be careful that you don't say anything good or bad. So when when Laban caught up to Jacob, well, they had some words, that's for sure. But Laban was careful. But then he got angry and he said, well, why did you steal my household gods? Jacob was angry right back. He says, nobody stole your household gods, and if you find anybody here that has them, well, then they won't live. I mean, Jacob didn't know that Rachel had stolen those gods. And so Laban, he searched Jacob's tent. He didn't find anything. He searched Leah's, nothing. He searched the maidservants. He didn't find anything there. And he went into Rachel's tent. Now, Rachel had her camel saddle inside her tent, and she had hidden those gods under that saddle, and she was sitting on the saddle, and she didn't get up when Laban came in. And so Laban rummaged around her tent, but he didn't find them. It was a foolish thing that Rachel did, taking those gods. But God was merciful to Rachel. Now, because of that warning that God had given Laban, it forced Laban to make a peace treaty with Jacob. And so they got together all these rocks, all these boulders, and they made a great big heap of them, a great big heap of stones. And the agreement was this: Laban said, I won't pass over this group of stones, this heap of stones, to harm you, and you won't come over the other way and harm me. And so they agreed. Jacob is having many troubles in his life. Things are a real mess because of sinful choices. And Jacob didn't understand all of what was happening and all of what was God was doing, but God was in control. And Jacob was learning to trust God. And we can trust him too with everything. Okay, see you next time.